Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and what I've been doing is just exploring different sort of options for creating an API. So in the previous video, I talked about how you can use the Airtable API as your database. Now, I've used Mongo database in a lot of the previous videos, but usually what we did is we'd use something like Mongoose to interact with our database on something like Mongo Atlas here, which is MongoDB's database as a service. But now Mongo has a new service that's actually pretty cool. It's called Stitch. Okay? And what Stitch does is that it basically allows you to create your database on Mongo, and instead of having to create your own API, it will basically provide you an API as a service. And this is kind of like a new, basically right now we're in the world of sort of headless development, in a sense where basically APIs are pretty standardized, even in the GraphQL era, which we're going to get to in a moment, that you can pretty much create software that automatically takes the data you have, generates an API. This is the same premise behind frameworks like Strapi, Hasura, Webany, that sort of just basically spin up an API for you. And that's essentially what Stitch does. Okay, it'll create the API for you, so that way you don't have to create necessarily your own backend application. You can just basically use the API that's created by Stitch and save yourself some time. Now, still at the end of the day, there's login and authorization credentials that have to be used to access these things. So kind of like I mentioned in the Airtable video, it's still probably smart to create a backend application, just if anything, just as a facade to hide your authorization tokens and credentials and manage those kind of things. But at least you don't have to sit there and create a database and worry about scaling and worry about the building of the API. You just basically would make the API call, basically let your backend application just make API calls to the pre-built API and then just serve those to your front end. So how does this work? So basically, once you have a free Mongo Atlas account, go to mongodb.com. Then all you have to do is just go to the Stitch section here, and you would just create a new app. And in the process of creating a new app, you'll just give it a name. And that's pretty much it. And you tell like which one of your databases you wanted to connect it to. Cool. And then you get to this section. So essentially, again, you would link a cluster, which is your database. Okay, you generally get one free one per project. Okay. Then you have to create a schema. So actually, let's take a look at that for a moment, because that's I'm so used to creating schemas through Mongoose. Okay, and Mongoose, it makes it pretty easy to create your schemas. It's a little bit trickier when you're doing it manually, because what you have to do is you have to go over to your cluster. So let's go over to our cluster. Actually, I need to go back to Atlas for a moment. Okay, so these are all the different Mongo services: Mongo Atlas, Mongo Stitch. I haven't actually tried the third one. Okay, which is Mongo Charts, which I'm assuming just generates charts based on the data in your. But let's see here. We go to collections. We go to tests. Actually, no, we don't need to go necessarily here. But these are my. This is my database, cluster 0, or that's my cluster. There's two databases, projects and tests, and inside test there's one collection called test. But really what you want to define your schema is actually over here in Stitch. You can tell, as usual, I just woke up. Okay, so it's taking us over here. I click on that thing. And then what you want to do is you go to rules. And here's where you have to do two things. One, you have to define roles. Okay, so you can actually, and the thing is, the cool thing about roles is that you create the roles not only based on each collection, so basically you have to define a role for each collection, but you can define multiple roles, and you can actually give them permissions by field. So I can create a role that only is able to like read and write the age field, but not the name field. So you can really get granular with who has access to what data, which is kind of cool. But then you go here, the schema. So you do have to create a role, at least one role, before you can actually use it. And you have to create a schema like this. I have to go read the Mongo documentation. to figure this one out. But essentially, basically, it's this. So if you want to pause it, you can just use this and use this as kind of a template for if you've ever done Mongo before you. This should speak to you. And essentially what it's just saying is that, okay, this is a BSON object. Okay, that's what this schema is describing. Okay, that requires two fields, name and age. Now the different properties that these objects have include name, which is a string, age, which is an integer of a okay, and the minimum number is 13, which doesn't have to be. Actually, I don't really need that, but I'm not going to change it right now. And I don't know what the exclusive minimum flag, or at least I don't remember what it does. But yeah, you create this thing, and then you always keep an eye out over here, because if you have unsaved changes, it's going to show up over here asking you to redeploy. And that caused me a whole lot of stress because I forgot to redeploy, and I was wondering why this was not working, and it turns out I just didn't hit the button. But then you'll create the schema, and then you'll save it. Then you can also define like relationships and filters. I haven't done those yet, but that's a cool thing you can do. Now, as far as development goes, there are system developer kits. So these have like plugins for different platforms that you can use. You can create users. Now, in users, no, I want to go back to. Was it rules that I want to go back to? I don't think so. I think it's. We'll come back to GraphQL, third-party services, values and secrets. No. Hosting, logs. Is it settings? No, it is users. Thought it wasn't users. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, so this is just different activity. Now what you want to do here is go to providers. Now providers is like basically how people can authenticate. And if you're just kind of playing with this and testing it out, the easiest way to go is to allow users to log in anonymously. You create edit, and then you don't have to worry about anything else. If you want to use other types of authentication, as the ones listed here, you'll turn those on, and then you have to read the documentation on the specifics of how your API call, your authorization call should be done. Now, one of the things I like, because I like GraphQL, is that this also generates you a GraphQL API. So you could use a traditional API, which with the SDK calls, which actually is more like using Mongoose. Or you can make GraphQL calls. And the cool thing is here, if you click here, it gives you access to graphical, so you can figure out what your different API calls are. And again, if you've ever used graphical before, it has built-in documentation, so I can go in there and take a look at all the different mutations, which are like how I create, edit, and delete data. I can go back and I can take a look at my different queries, is how I search for data. And then I can try them out here until I get it to work. So this is just a generic query to find all the records. So I hit play, and I can see it finds the data, so it works. So that's nice. And if you need to create custom resolvers, you can do that here. Okay, you can play with the schema there and change other settings there. Okay, so that's pretty nice. Okay, then here it gives you the URL to make API calls. Okay, so let me just show you a quick example of me using it. So again, here I'm using Axio, so I'm using a backend. This is a backend Node application. I take the app ID because I figured it would be a good idea to save in a variable. I create a variable for my authentication, my refresh token, and my access token. Const URL. This is sort of my GraphQL URL saved in there for easy access. So first, I have my authorization function because I need to go get, because right now my auth is just undefined. I need to go get my tokens. So that's what this function does. So it's async. So again, in this case, I'm not using any kind of GraphQL client like Apollo. You could. I just figured this was sort of an easier way to test things out. So this function, what it does, it creates a post request to this URL. Again, to find that, you can read the documentation. That's right here. Learn how to retrieve, and it shows you a bunch of different ways to do that. So basically, you send, and since I have anonymous user provider set up, then it just sends me back a token. So basically, this will go get the token, and then I assign that data over to the auth variable, and that's what that function does. Okay, then I do a get all function, and first thing I do is I check, hey, have I authorized myself already? If I have, then I should already have a refresh and access token, which I'll then destructure. If I haven't, then I'll go run the authorize function. So that's what this line does. Okay, then I make a post request, because pretty much all GraphQL queries under the hood are post requests. That's literally what they all are. You're just making a post request to the GraphQL server, and just sending it a JSON string, essentially. It's what it is. So basically here I have my headers, and I have one header for my content type, which is JSON, and then another header with my token. So authorization, bearer, and there's my token. Okay. Then, since I'm using Axios, this is not body, but data. Again, that's the difference between Axios and using just plain old fetch. So then I stringify my object, which is an object with a property query. It would be mutation if I was sending a mutation to update or create or delete a record. And then with my query string, okay, which again I can just copy over from here. So what I can do is find the right query, create the right query here. Because again, you can click on here and then just literally make it. So like, let's say I want to do something like this, or mutation, insert many tests, insert one test. Okay. Go back down here. So if I want to do like a mutation, I would do mutation. Let's see here. Insert one test. And then I gotta pass in some test user input, which requires a property called, which is an object. Actually, no, I gotta do this. It's gonna be called test data. And the data object is gonna have name, which we'll say is Bob Jones. And age 33. And that should be it, because it's just, now was it complaining that field insert one of type test must have a selection of subfields. Did you mean insert one test? Oh, I need to do also then, I guess, return a query. So name, age. So basically, I want the name and age of the one I created. Give it back to me. So there we go. So now if I run this, then there's successfully inserted one. Okay, and so then I can copy that mutation and copy that string over into here. But since I just inserted one, I should have another record in there. So now if I run this code, I should get back not just this object, but the other object as well. So let me just run this code. Well, maybe they didn't actually, maybe the test doesn't insert. But yeah, so that would, so you can see that query, it did that. It just basically got me the name and age of all the records. Okay, so I'm assuming this test GraphQL doesn't actually mutate data, or it just tests. So let me just do a copy of this. So we'll just show you that it does work. So then this would become mutation. I would change the string around. And again, if I'm making like a real function, I'd probably interpolate the user's selections there. But let's see here. Let's save. Let's try this out. It did not like that. Let's take a look. Let's examine. Okay, let's try something else. Query. I think maybe it wants me to put the mutation here. Mutation. Let's try that out. So if I do that, yep, that's what it does. Okay, cool. So see, I successfully inserted one. So now let's see if that actually got entered into my database. So let's go back all the way over here to Atlas. So we can go examine the database, see if the additional record was added. Go over to collections. Not people. It's going to be in test. And in test. There you go. Okay, we can see the different people who were selected. Cool. And then again, if I just do this, I control Z. Back to it's there, save. Let's try to run that again. Just needs to be query. Still only returns. Okay. Cool. And that's how Mongo Stitch works. I'll talk to you guys later on.